No warning. No congressional vote. No public debate. No declaration of war. In a matter of hours, the United States of America had entered a full-scale military conflict against Iran, and most members of Congress found out about it not in a classified briefing room, not through a secure phone call from the White House, but the same way millions of ordinary Americans did, through their phones, through breaking news alerts, through the glow of television screens in their living rooms. The strikes were massive. Coordinated with Israel, the joint military operation targeted Iranian military installations, command centers, and political leadership. Within the first 24 hours, the world received confirmation of something almost too dramatic to believe. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was dead, killed in the strikes alongside multiple senior Iranian officials. The head of one of the world's most powerful theocracies had been eliminated in a single night of American and Israeli firepower. Markets shook. Oil prices spiked. Embassies across the Middle East locked their doors. Thousands of American citizens living in the region rushed to airports, flooding phone lines at congressional offices, begging for help getting out. And in Washington, D.C., in the halls of the United States Congress, something else was happening, something quieter, but in many ways far more consequential for the future of American democracy. Lawmakers were furious. Not just Democrats, though they were loud and immediate in their outrage. Even some Republicans, those who had stood loyally behind Donald Trump through every controversy of his presidency, were pulling aside aides and whispering uncomfortable questions into the ears of colleagues. Did the president have the legal authority to do this? Did he bypass Congress? Was this constitutional? These were not small questions. These were the kinds of questions that, in the history of the United States, had brought down presidents, sparked constitutional amendments, and reshaped the very foundations of American government. Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, a Democrat who had spent years working on war powers issues, was among the first to go public. He had been a co-sponsor of war powers legislation before the strikes even happened. Legislation meant to curb executive overreach on military action. Now, with bombs already falling on Iranian soil and American troops already placed on elevated alert across the region, he went before the cameras and said what many in Washington were only whispering. The Constitution says we're not supposed to be at war without a vote of Congress, Kaine declared. The lives of our troops are at risk. We ought to come back to Washington right away and vote on this. Simple words, but they carried enormous weight. Because here is what Kaine was pointing to. Here is the foundation of the entire constitutional battle that was about to explode across the United States Capitol. Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution is crystal clear. It grants Congress, and Congress alone, the power to declare war. Not the president, not the military, not the National Security Council. Congress. For centuries, this had been a bedrock principle of American democracy. The Founding Fathers, who had just fought a revolution against a king who could send armies wherever he wished without accountability, were deeply, almost obsessively concerned about concentrating war-making power in the hands of a single person. They built the Constitution specifically to prevent that from happening. And now, in February 2026, President Donald Trump had launched what administration officials themselves were calling a war, without asking Congress for a single vote. The question hanging over Washington like smoke from a burning city was this: what was Congress going to do about it? The answer to that question would unfold over the next several days in one of the most dramatic, consequential, and deeply revealing political battles in modern American history. It would expose the fractures running through both political parties. It would test the limits of constitutional law. It would force every single member of Congress to stand up and be counted. And it would leave the country asking a question that had no easy answer. In the America of 2026, does the Constitution still mean what it says? The clock was ticking, and Congress had just days to act. To understand why the battle over the Iran war was so explosive, so constitutionally dangerous, you have to understand the long, complicated history of what legal scholars call the war powers debate in America. It did not start with Donald Trump. It did not start with Barack Obama or George W. Bush or even Bill Clinton. It started decades ago, slowly and almost invisibly, as American presidents began doing something the Founding Fathers never intended: going to war without asking Congress first. The Constitution is unambiguous on this point. Article 1 gives Congress the power to declare war. Article 2 makes the president the commander-in-chief of the military. But that means he commands the armed forces once they are deployed, not that he can deploy them into war whenever he chooses. The distinction is crucial. The president can respond to an immediate attack on the United States. He can order emergency military actions to protect American lives in imminent danger. But launching a sustained, planned military campaign against a foreign nation, that requires Congress. For most of American history, this system worked imperfectly, but it worked. Congress declared war against Britain in 1812. Congress declared war against Germany and Japan in the 1940s. These were formal, legal, constitutional processes. But then came Korea in 1950. Then Vietnam in the 1960s. Presidents began sending hundreds of thousands of American troops into combat without formal declarations of war, justifying their actions under broad interpretations of their commander-in-chief authority. Congress grew alarmed. In 1973, in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, one of the most catastrophic foreign policy disasters in American history, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution. The law was a compromise. It acknowledged that presidents might need to act quickly in emergencies. It gave them authority to introduce forces into hostilities without prior congressional approval, but it required them to notify Congress within 48 hours of doing so, and it set a 60-day clock. After 60 days, the president had to either get congressional authorization for the conflict or begin withdrawing troops. Every president since 1973 has complied with the notification requirement, reluctantly, often under protest, but they complied. And before major conflicts, presidents typically sought congressional authorization. Before the Gulf War in 1991, George H.W. Bush got a congressional vote. Before the Iraq War in 2003, George W. Bush made a months-long push to secure authorization from Congress. No such vote was attempted for Iran. Trump had ordered strikes not just once, but in a pattern stretching back through his second term. In June 2025, U.S. strikes had targeted Iran's nuclear facilities as part of a 12-day war led by Israel. Then, in January 2026, Trump had ordered military action in Venezuela, capturing President Nicolas Maduro and bringing him to the United States to stand trial. Congress had tried to assert itself after the Venezuela Operation 2. A Senate War Powers Resolution failed by a single vote. Now with the Iran war far larger, far more dangerous, involving the death of a head of state, the constitutional crisis had reached a breaking point. What made the situation even more legally precarious was the shifting, contradictory rationale the Trump administration was offering for the strikes. Legally, under Article 2, a president can take unilateral military action if there is an imminent threat to the United States. The key word is imminent, meaning immediate, concrete, specific. It cannot be a vague, general threat. It has to be something happening right now, something so urgent there is no time to consult Congress. But when senators and representatives emerged from classified briefings on the Iran strikes, many were deeply skeptical. Senator Tim Kaine went further than skeptical. He was emphatic. Speaking from the Senate floor, he declared that in those classified briefings, the Trump administration could produce no evidence, none, that the U.S. was under an imminent threat of attack from Iran. This was a devastating allegation. If true, it meant the legal justification for bypassing Congress did not hold up. It meant the strikes were not a response to an immediate emergency. They were a deliberate, planned act of war carried out without constitutional authorization. Then came another problem, Trump's own words. The president himself, along with his Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kaine, had all publicly described what was happening as a war, not a military operation, not a strategic strike, a war. Senator Kaine seized on this in his floor speech with blunt, prosecutorial logic. The President of the United States has called it a war against Iran. The head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has called it a war against Iran. Secretary Rubio, our Secretary of State, has called it a war against Iran. Members of the Senate, this is war. And if it was a war, the Constitution was clear about who had the power to start one. Meanwhile, the human cost of the conflict was already becoming real in the most tragic way possible. 6 American military members had been killed in a drone strike in Kuwait, the first American combat deaths of the conflict, almost certainly not the last. Their families were grieving. Their home states were grieving. And Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was already saying publicly that the war could extend 8 weeks, twice as long as the president had initially suggested. He would not rule out the possibility of American ground troops being sent into Iran. The constitutional issue was no longer abstract. It was personal. It was about whether the sons and daughters of American families would continue to be sent into a war that their elected representatives in Congress had never approved. The stage was set for a confrontation unlike anything Washington had seen in years. Congress was about to vote, and the entire country was watching. Tuesday, March 3, 2026, Washington, D.C. All 100 United States senators had been called back to the Capitol for a classified briefing. They filed into a secure room, Republicans and Democrats together, and for hours, Trump administration officials laid out their case for the Iran war. Intelligence briefings, military assessments, strategic rationale. When the senators emerged, their reactions told the whole story. Some Republicans came out nodding, satisfied. Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana put it bluntly, "You can't be halfway pregnant. We're in there. And by the way, I thought they just made a good case why we are. And so, right now we've got to support the troops." Senator Kevin Cramer of North Dakota said the Constitution gives the commander-in-chief a great deal of latitude and power with regard to kinetic action, and that Trump certainly hasn't exceeded that. But Democrats came out of the same briefing with a very different verdict. Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut was almost visibly shaken as he spoke to reporters. "We shouldn't be acting like this is business as usual," he said. "We shouldn't be proceeding to legislation, providing votes to proceed to legislation until they put an authorization for military force on the floor of the United States Senate. This is as serious as it gets. This is war and peace." The War Powers Resolution was scheduled for a vote in the Senate on Wednesday, March 4th. Senator Tim Kaine had co-authored the resolution with Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, an unusual alliance that crossed party lines and sent a signal about just how serious some lawmakers were about reclaiming congressional authority. Rand Paul was a libertarian-leaning Republican who had long been suspicious of executive overreach on military matters. His willingness to join with Democrats on this resolution was significant. The resolution's language was direct. It called for removing United States armed forces from hostilities within or against Iran unless explicitly authorized by a declaration of war or a specific authorization for use of military force from Congress. On Wednesday, the Senate voted. The result, 47 in favor, 53 against. The resolution failed to reach even the simple majority needed to move forward. The breakdown was almost perfectly along party lines. Only 2 senators crossed over. John Fetterman of Pennsylvania, a Democrat, voted no, joining Republicans. Rand Paul, a Republican, voted yes, joining Democrats. 1 vote, 1 senator crossing party lines in either direction. That was the margin. Senate Democrats and their allies were furious, but not finished. The House of Representatives was expected to vote on a similar resolution the very next day, Thursday, March 5th. On the House side, the math was even tighter. Republicans controlled the chamber, but only narrowly. The War Powers Resolution had been introduced by Representatives Ro Khanna of California and Thomas Massie of Kentucky. Again, a bipartisan duo, with Massie being a libertarian-leaning Republican who rarely aligned with Democrats on anything. The debate on the House floor was electric. Representative Jamie Raskin of Maryland, a constitutional scholar and Democrat, stood at the podium and invoked the Founding Fathers with unmistakable passion. The framers weren't fooling around. "It's up to us." Representative Gregory Meeks, the top Democrat on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, delivered what became perhaps the most quoted line of the entire debate. "Donald Trump is not a king, and if he believes the war with Iran is in our national interest, then he must come to Congress and make the case." On the other side, House Speaker Mike Johnson of Louisiana, one of Trump's closest allies in Congress, argued that it would be dangerous to limit the president's authority while the U.S. military was already engaged. In a statement that would immediately draw mockery and bewilderment from Democrats, he declared, "We are not at war. Even as U.S. bombers were flying missions over Iran, 6 American service members were being buried, and the president himself had described the conflict as a war. When the final vote came, the outcome was 212 in favor of the resolution, 219 against. It failed by just 7 votes. 2 Republicans broke with their party and voted with Democrats in favor of the resolution. 4 Democrats broke with their party and voted against it. 7 votes. In a chamber of 435 members. That was the margin by which Donald Trump retained unrestricted authority to continue his war in Iran without congressional approval. But here is what made the moment even more politically charged. Something that added a layer of complexity, of suspense, of almost theatrical drama to the entire situation. Even if both chambers had passed the War Powers Resolution, Trump was almost certainly going to veto it. And overriding a presidential veto requires a 2/3 majority in both chambers. No one believed there were anywhere near enough votes for that. Congress had never, not once in American history, successfully overridden a presidential veto of a War Powers Resolution. So the votes were, in a strictly practical sense, symbolic. They were not going to stop the war, and yet they were anything but meaningless. Because what those votes revealed, what they documented for the historical record and for the American public, was something profound. By a margin of just 7 votes in the House, Congress had declined to assert its constitutional authority over war. The majority had chosen party loyalty over constitutional principle. The majority had looked at the plain text of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and decided that, right now, in this moment, it did not fully apply. The constitutional crisis was no longer theoretical. It was on the record, and the battle was far from over. March 2026 did not arrive in a vacuum. The War Powers showdown over Iran was the most dramatic moment in a constitutional crisis that had been building, piece by piece, for more than a year, and in some ways for decades. When Donald Trump returned to the White House for his second term in January 2025, he came with an agenda that was breathtaking in its scope and its ambition. He wanted to reshape not just policy, but the very structure of American government. And in the early months of his second term, he moved with extraordinary speed. Within weeks of taking office, Trump had paused federal spending that Congress had already appropriated, a direct challenge to Congress's constitutional power over the federal purse. He had issued an executive order attempting to end birthright citizenship, a right guaranteed by the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. He had fired inspectors general, the independent watchdogs embedded in federal agencies to prevent corruption, without notifying Congress as required by law. He had used the Department of Justice to pursue what critics described as political retribution against his enemies. By some counts, nearly 180 lawsuits from states and national organizations had been filed challenging Trump administration actions on constitutional grounds. Federal judges had repeatedly issued rulings blocking executive actions. In what became perhaps the most jarring moment of all, the Trump administration defied a Supreme Court order to return a wrongfully deported man, Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia, a Maryland resident who had been sent to El Salvador despite a court order forbidding it, setting up a direct confrontation between the executive branch and the nation's highest court. The Constitutional Accountability Center's director David Gans put it plainly. The current administration had threatened core aspects of the U.S. Constitution. But the constitutional crisis, many scholars argued, was not just about what Trump was doing. It was equally about what Congress was not doing. Representative Mary Gay Scanlon of Pennsylvania, a Democrat, described the 119th Congress, the Republican-controlled Congress of Trump's second term, as absent. The absence, she said, included a lack of oversight and the passive transfer of power from the legislative to the executive branch. This was the deeper, more uncomfortable truth about the American constitutional crisis of 2026. The Constitution's system of checks and balances depends not just on one branch staying within its limits. It depends on the other branches actively enforcing those limits. The Constitution gives Congress enormous power. It controls the federal budget. It can override presidential vetoes with a 2/3 vote. It can impeach and remove a president. It can refuse to confirm executive nominees. It can cut off funding for military operations. It can pass legislation constraining executive action. But all of those powers require Congress to use them. and a Congress that chooses not to use its powers, a Congress that defers, that stays quiet, that prioritizes party loyalty over institutional responsibility, effectively hands those powers to the president. This is what Stanford historian Jack Rakove described when he wrote that America's constitutional crisis was not just about Trump's overreach. It was about the failure of the legislative and judicial branches to adequately check the executive. The problem, he wrote, was the failure of the legislative and judicial branches to check the president. Senator Cory Booker captured the paradox when he wrote, "Today, many leaders will rightly condemn President Trump's unlawful and unjust actions in Venezuela, and I join them. But just as glaring and far more damning is Congress's ongoing abdication of its constitutional duty. And the financial dimensions of Trump's presidency added yet another layer of constitutional concern." Legal scholars pointed to the emoluments clauses of the Constitution, provisions designed to prevent presidents from profiting from their office or from foreign governments. Yet the Trump family's business interests, their cryptocurrency ventures, their real estate empire, continued to operate and even flourish in ways that critics argued blurred the lines between the presidency and personal financial gain. The picture that emerged from all of this was not one of a simple villain and clear heroes. It was something more complicated and in some ways more frightening. A system of government under extraordinary stress, its safeguards being tested simultaneously on multiple fronts, its defenders divided and sometimes uncertain, its rules being reinterpreted in real time. And all of it was building toward the midterm elections of November 2026. Elections that would determine control of both the House and Senate, and with them, the practical ability of Congress to assert itself as a co-equal branch of government. The League of Women Voters said it directly. Voters in 2026 would determine whether Congress was led by representatives willing to check executive power or those who would exacerbate the current crisis. The Brennan Center for Justice framed it in terms of historical hope. The laws of political gravity had not been repealed, they wrote. Abuse had been met with response. But would the response be enough? And would it come in time? That question was still unanswered. And it led directly to the final, most urgent chapter of this story. The war powers votes of March 4th and 5th, 2026, did not end the constitutional battle. They escalated it. Senator Tim Kaine, who had co-authored the Senate War Powers Resolution and watched it fail, made something clear to anyone who thought the fight was over. This is not a one and done. The votes will be the first effort of all Congress going on the record about this. But I can assure you it's not going to be the last. And he was right, because even as the immediate war powers votes were being counted, multiple other fronts in the constitutional battle were opening simultaneously. The appropriations front. Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, one of Trump's most reliable allies, had inadvertently highlighted one of Congress's most powerful remaining tools when he addressed the war powers debate. If you want to stop this war, say, we will not pay for it. He meant it as a dismissal of the war powers resolution. But Democrats heard it as a reminder. Congress controls the federal budget. It controls the money. If Congress chose to, it could refuse to appropriate funds for the Iran war. It could attach conditions to military spending bills. It could use the power of the purse, the oldest and most fundamental congressional power, as a check on the president. Senator Chris Murphy was already thinking in these terms, calling on Democrats to use every available tool, including the appropriations process, to assert congressional authority over the war. The legal front. Even as Congress debated and voted, federal courts were being asked to weigh in. The Constitutional Accountability Center, the ACLU, and dozens of other legal organizations were monitoring the Iran situation for potential constitutional violations. Under Article 2, the president's unilateral war-making authority is limited to situations of genuine imminent threat. If that threshold could not be established, and senators like Kaine argued it could not be, then legal challenges to the war's constitutionality were possible. The 2026 midterm front, perhaps the most consequential battlefield of all, was the one furthest in the future, but closest to the hearts of every politician in Washington. The November 2026 midterm elections. Both the House and Senate were up for grabs. If Democrats, and potentially some anti-war Republicans, made the constitutional issues of executive overreach, war powers, and the rule of law central to their campaigns, they might be able to build the kind of electoral coalition that would flip one or both chambers. And if Democrats took the House or Senate in 2026, the entire dynamic of the constitutional battle would change overnight. A Democratic-controlled committee could subpoena administration officials. A Democratic-controlled chamber could refuse to advance Trump's legislative agenda until war authorization was sought. The oversight mechanisms that had been largely dormant under Republican leadership could snap back into operation. The Supreme Court front. In March 2026, the Supreme Court was already preparing to hear a case with significant implications for the 2026 elections. Watson versus Republican National Committee, a case that could affect voting rights and electoral maps for the upcoming midterms. The court's decisions on executive power, on congressional authority, on constitutional limits would ripple through every other front of the battle. But underneath all of these specific legal and political battles, something even larger was at stake. Something that went beyond any single war, any single vote, any single court case. The United States Constitution is not self-enforcing. It is a document, a piece of parchment with words on it. Those words have power only insofar as the people who swear oaths to uphold them actually do so. Senators, representatives, judges, presidents, they all take oaths to support and defend the Constitution. But oaths are only as meaningful as the commitment behind them. The Founding Fathers designed a system of government that they believed would be self-correcting. Ambition would counteract ambition. James Madison wrote in Federalist 51. Each branch of government would jealously guard its own powers against encroachment by the others. The system would balance itself, not because the people in it were virtuous, but because the structure gave each branch an institutional incentive to check the others. But what happens when one branch, Congress, decides that its institutional interests are less important than its partisan interests? What happens when members of Congress decide that their loyalty to a president of their own party outweighs their loyalty to the institution of Congress itself? That is the question the United States of America was confronting in March 2026. Not just in the context of the Iran war, not just in the context of the war powers debate, but in every aspect of the constitutional crisis that had been building for more than a year. Representative Jamie Raskin had said it on the House floor. The framers weren't fooling around. They weren't. They built a system of government designed to prevent any single person or faction from accumulating unchecked power. They built it because they had lived under a king, because they understood what it meant to have your life, your property, your liberty subject to the will of one man who answered to no one. They built the Constitution as a promise to every American, not just in 1787, but in 2026 and beyond, that this would be a government of laws, not of men, that no president would be a king, that no executive order could override the will of the people as expressed through their elected representatives in Congress. Whether that promise would hold, whether the constitutional architecture the founders built would survive the stress test of this extraordinary moment in American history, depended on choices being made right now, in real time, by real people. It depended on senators deciding whether their oath to the Constitution meant more than their loyalty to a party. It depended on representatives deciding whether 7 votes was a number they could live with when the history books were written. It depended on voters deciding in November 2026 what kind of Congress they wanted to send to Washington, one that would continue to step aside, or one that would finally step up. It depended on courts deciding whether the rule of law would hold firm even when the executive branch tested its limits. And it depended on the American people, on every citizen who read a news article, watched a debate, called a congressional office, or showed up to vote, deciding whether they believed the Constitution still mattered. The war in Iran was ongoing. The constitutional battle was ongoing. The crisis was ongoing. But this much was certain. The story of the American Republic, the oldest constitutional democracy in the world, was being written right now in the corridors of Congress, in the chambers of the Supreme Court, in the Oval Office, and in the hearts and minds of 330 million Americans. And how it ended was not yet written. That part, the most important part of all, was still up to them.